It started like any normal morning, the sun barely peeking over the trees lining my property. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, ready to check the creek that had run through my land for decades. The gentle trickle of water had always been a soothing constant, a little lifeline winding its way past meadows, under the old bridge, and feeding the pond downstream. But today, the sound was gone. In its place was a sharp, unnatural crunch. Concrete. Everywhere. Wet, gray, smothering the creek bed. My eyes widened. My fingers trembled as I stepped closer, realizing the magnitude of what I was seeing. The creek, the lifeline of the land, had been filled in with hard, cold concrete, completely blocking its flow. I ran my hand across the surface. Still warm, still freshly poured. And then I noticed something else. Tire tracks. Heavy machinery had rolled through my property. Bulldozers, cement mixers, dump trucks, all moving as if they owned the land. I checked the edges, following the newly formed concrete channel. At first glance, it seemed organized, planned. But the deeper I looked, the more chaotic it became. Erosion already forming along the edges, small pools of water trapped and stagnant. Even in this first morning, I could see the beginnings of a disaster. Then the calls started. Neighbors buzzing, some in disbelief, others whispering with concern. The HOA had taken over. Not for repairs. Not for safety. They claimed it was for community improvement and preventing flooding. But there was no warning. No discussion. No permit posted. Just unilateral action that had forever altered my land. I went to the HOA office, demanding answers. The receptionist handed me a notice. It was vague, bureaucratic, filled with phrases like enhancing property value and protecting community interests. No mention of environmental laws, no acknowledgement of property rights, no hint of remorse. And then I saw her. Karen, the HOA president, standing at the corner of the lot, clipboard in hand, surveying her handiwork like a general inspecting a battlefield. She smiled, assuming I would be impressed or intimidated. "It's for the greater good," she said casually. "Everyone benefits from this." I stared at her, concrete stretching like a gray scar through my property. "Everyone?" I asked. "Including my land?" She didn't answer, just scribbled something on her clipboard, turned, and walked away. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be simple. They had destroyed a natural waterway, jeopardized ecosystems, and completely ignored the fact that their million-dollar home sat downstream, on land that now had no proper drainage. At that moment, I understood two things. The HOA thought they could control nature with concrete. They had no idea that nature, and karma, always has the last word. I snapped photos, videos, timestamps, everything. Every angle, every inch of destruction. This wasn't just property damage. This was evidence. And soon, it would be the key to showing the HOA that their arrogance would have consequences. By mid-morning, the situation was spiraling. Rain clouds gathered on the horizon, a soft gray that seemed almost like a warning. I stood at the edge of my property, watching as small puddles began forming along the newly paved concrete creek. Where water once flowed freely, it now stagnated. Tiny plants that used to line the banks were wilting, their roots trapped in cement. I could already feel the smell of trapped mud and decay starting to rise. Neighbors started showing up, some cautiously, peeking from behind fences, others more boldly, walking right onto my property to see what had happened. I handed out my phone, showing before and after pictures of the creek. Gasps. Whispers. "This isn't legal," one elderly neighbor muttered. "They can't just do this." Meanwhile, Karen, of course, was nowhere in sight. Her absence didn't surprise me. She had made her move early, thinking she could act without consequences. Thinking she was untouchable. I wasn't about to let that happen. I called the local environmental enforcement office. The person on the other end asked me for a full report, pictures, and a sworn statement. By the time I hung up, I knew I had just escalated the situation from a neighborhood feud to an official investigation. But that wasn't all. By noon, the first effects of their community improvement were starting to show. Water that once flowed downstream began pooling around the foundations of the homes closest to my property. Sidewalks that had been dry in every storm were now soggy and cracked. Lawns were turning into mud pits. Homeowners who had once nodded along with Karen's ideas now came knocking on my gate, anxious and confused. I didn't have to say anything. They were already realizing what I knew from the first moment. Concrete doesn't replace nature. At 1:30 p.m., I received an email from the HOA board. Subject line: Urgent. Creek modification update. I opened it, expecting arrogance or deflection. Instead, it was thinly veiled panic. They claimed the project was fully compliant and that any water pooling was temporary and manageable. The email ended with an ominous note: Please refrain from public discussion until we assess the situation. Translation: They were scrambling. And I wasn't even done. I decided to take a closer look at the damage. My boots sank slightly into the wet, concrete-covered banks as I followed the flow. What little flow remained. I noticed cracks forming in the slab, small fissures where water was already forcing its way underneath. If this continued, the HOA homes built downstream were going to be at risk. I took multiple videos, walking slowly along the concrete's edge, pointing out everything: blocked drainage, water pooling, potential foundation damage. By late afternoon, rain started lightly falling. The pooling worsened. One neighbor came running, panicked, shouting that water was creeping toward their backyard. I calmly showed them the photos and explained the concrete had blocked the natural creek flow. This will only get worse if nothing is done, I said. Meanwhile, Karen finally appeared, clipboard in hand, eyes darting nervously. She tried to assert control, waving her hand and shouting about planned mitigation. But by now, the mood had shifted. Neighbors weren't intimidated. They were angry. They were scared. And they were listening to me. I knew the moment had arrived. The HOA had overstepped. Nature, documentation, and witnesses were all on my side. Karen's confidence, her usual aura of untouchable authority, was cracking. By the time evening came, the first official call from the county arrived. An inspector was scheduled for tomorrow morning to assess the creek and any potential risk to downstream properties. Karen was informed, but now the fear was evident in her tone. For the first time, the HOA president realized this wasn't a problem she could sign off and move past. This was legal, environmental, and structural. And by tomorrow, she would find out that concrete doesn't just cover mistakes, it exposes them. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rushing water, but not where it should have been. Instead of flowing through the creek bed, it gurgled and pooled across the lowlands of the HOA neighborhood. The concrete that had fixed the creek had turned the area into a bottleneck, and gravity was already doing what nature does best, reclaiming its path. I grabbed my phone and started filming immediately. From my vantage point on the bluff overlooking the properties, I could see standing water creeping toward lawns, sidewalks, and the edges of some of the HOA's multi-million-dollar homes. Trees that had grown along the creek were partially submerged. The smell of wet soil and stagnant water filled the air. Neighbors came running. Some were yelling, some were crying, and some were frantically trying to move valuables off their lower yards. Karen arrived last, in her usual heels and power blazer, but this time she didn't have her clipboard out. She stopped at the edge of a flooded yard, staring at the scene like she hadn't expected nature to respond this quickly. "It's temporary," she shouted. "We can manage it." But I didn't respond. Instead, I stepped forward, pointing toward the homes that were slowly surrounded by muddy water. "The creek wasn't a problem," I said calmly. "Filling it with concrete is the problem." Her face twitched, a micro-expression of panic and disbelief. "We did it for safety," she yelled. "We followed HOA protocol." Protocol. She repeated it like a mantra, but it was meaningless now. The ground, water, and weather didn't care about HOA rules. They cared about physics. And physics was winning. I dialed the county environmental office. Within minutes, an inspector was on site, walking the affected areas with a clipboard, measuring water flow, taking photos, and noting damage. Karen tried to intervene, waving papers and muttering about permissions, bylaws, and emergency action. The inspector stopped, raised a hand, and shook his head. "This is not compliant," he said firmly. "Concrete fills on natural watercourses without permits are illegal. This endangers property and violates environmental statutes. Access must be restricted immediately." Karen's eyes widened. She tried to argue, but every statement was countered with law, documentation, or the cold facts of rising water levels. Her voice, usually commanding, faltered. The HOA board members who had joined her that morning were quiet. Their authority had evaporated under scrutiny. By noon, the situation escalated further. Rain intensified. The backyard of one of the million-dollar homes was now partially submerged. Water was seeping under patios and around foundation edges. I filmed everything, timestamps, GPS locations, damage in real time. This wasn't speculation. This was undeniable evidence of mismanagement and liability. Neighbors started calling emergency services themselves. Some were packing sandbags. Others were trying to divert water with temporary channels. Everyone looked to me because I had warned them, documented everything, and maintained control while Karen's HOA panic spiraled. Karen retreated to her SUV, pacing and muttering to herself. Her aura of control, so carefully cultivated over years, was gone. This wasn't just a failed project. It was an unfolding disaster that could bankrupt the HOA. By late afternoon, a county inspector officially warned the HOA, "Stop all construction, remove unauthorized concrete, and restore natural flow immediately. Failure to comply may result in fines and legal action." Karen's phone buzzed incessantly. Emails, calls, emergency notices. Every HOA member was now involved, and the public documentation of the creek disaster had begun to spread through the neighborhood and local media. Standing on my bluff, watching the water rise and the home slowly threatened, I realized this was more than just property rights. This was karma in motion, a physical reminder that nature always has the final word, and HOA arrogance cannot override it. By nightfall, the concrete-filled creek had turned from an improvement to a ticking time bomb. And Karen? She would finally have to answer for every decision she thought she could get away with. By sunrise the next day, the neighborhood was in chaos. Water levels had risen further, spreading into yards, sidewalks, and even some driveways. The very homes Karen and the HOA had proudly built now seemed trapped in a swamp, their foundations slowly threatened by the unnatural bottleneck of the filled-in creek. Karen appeared again, this time flanked by several board members. Clipboard in hand, she attempted to project authority, but her usual confidence was missing. The look in her eyes betrayed panic. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. "They're overreacting," she muttered to a neighbor, but even she knew that no amount of bluster would stop what was happening. I had already called the county environmental office again. Inspectors were on site, measuring water levels, noting damage, and recording the structural risk to the HOA homes. Every step, every observation, was meticulously documented. Photographs, timestamps, GPS coordinates. There was no escaping accountability. One inspector approached Karen and her board. "You filled a natural watercourse without permits. Your actions have caused direct flooding and environmental damage. This is a serious violation." Karen opened her mouth, likely to argue, but the inspector continued. "You have 24 hours to submit a remediation plan, remove the concrete, and restore natural water flow. Noncompliance will result in fines and potential civil or criminal liability." Her face went pale. For years, she had relied on intimidation, fines, and HOA politics to get her way. For the first time, official authority had overridden her. By late morning, panic had fully spread through the HOA. Homeowners who had once nodded along to every decree were now calling meetings, demanding answers. They questioned not just Karen but the entire board. How did this happen? Who approved this? Are our homes at risk? The first homeowners whose backyards were partially submerged walked to my property. They wanted explanations, advice, and guidance. I calmly showed them photos, pointed out the blocked drainage, and explained what was happening. Their fear turned to understanding, and then to anger, directed squarely at Karen. By mid-afternoon, local news caught wind of the story. Reporters arrived, cameras rolling, asking questions about environmental violations and HOA authority. Karen and her board members were cornered, forced to answer questions they couldn't legally dodge. Every word they spoke contradicted the evidence piling up. Meanwhile, rain continued to fall lightly, adding urgency. The flooded properties made it clear the concrete-filled creek wasn't just a mistake, it was negligence. Lawsuits were now likely, insurance companies were alerted, and the HOA's credibility was in ruins. Karen attempted one last power play, a stern warning to residents and neighbors not to share photos or videos online. It was laughable. In the age of smartphones and social media, the evidence was already viral. Neighbors were uploading footage in real time, and each clip showed water creeping dangerously close to luxury homes. By evening, Karen retreated from public view. The HOA released a brief statement promising review and corrective action, but it was hollow. The damage was done, both physically and reputationally. From my porch, I watched the creek, now partially flowing in diverted channels, and the waterlogged homes below. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice served naturally. Nature had reclaimed its course, and the HOA and Karen had learned, painfully, that arrogance and greed have consequences you cannot cement away. By the time night fell, the neighborhood was quiet but tense. Everyone knew the storm wasn't just weather, it was accountability, and it was only beginning. The next morning, the true extent of the disaster became undeniable. Water that had pooled behind the concrete-filled creek was now spreading more aggressively, saturating lawns and creeping dangerously close to foundations. The million-dollar homes Karen and the HOA had so proudly built were no longer just threatened. They were in real peril. Neighbors who had once quietly tolerated Karen's authority were now openly confronting her. Phones in hand, cameras rolling, they demanded answers. Why wasn't this permitted? One homeowner shouted. Did you even consider the consequences? Another added. Karen arrived mid-morning, clipboard clutched tightly, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. She attempted to reassert control, pointing at documents, bylaws, and permits. But the county inspectors were already on site, surveying the flooded areas, documenting property damage, and taking photos for official reports. Every word she spoke was met with skepticism, every gesture ignored. The county officials called a meeting with the HOA board on the spot. The inspectors outlined the violations: unauthorized modification of a natural watercourse, obstruction of drainage, environmental damage, and potential structural risk to private property. Karen's eyes widened as the consequences were spelled out. Fines, legal action, and insurance claims were now inevitable. Meanwhile, I stood on the bluff overlooking the flooded neighborhood, calmly capturing footage. Every angle, every inch of damage was evidence. The homeowners around me looked both relieved and shocked. They'd spent years fearing Karen's whims, and now the situation had reversed completely. By noon, the HOA's own attorney arrived, urging the board to cooperate fully. Karen tried to speak, tried to justify her actions, but even her lawyer's stern glance silenced her. The paperwork, inspections, and videos had created an undeniable chain of accountability. She could no longer hide behind her position. Water continued to creep, making it clear that the concrete-filled creek had irreparably disrupted natural drainage. Residents were scrambling to protect their properties, some using sandbags, others digging temporary channels. Karen's assurances that it's manageable fell flat. The reality was stark. The HOA's arrogance had put every homeowner at risk. By mid-afternoon, the board issued a formal statement. Karen would step down as president immediately. Emergency meetings were called to address liability and remediation. The HOA's reputation was shattered. Homeowners demanded audits, new leadership, and legal oversight. Karen left the property late in the day, visibly defeated. For years, she had relied on intimidation, authority, and fear to control her community. Now, she was powerless, watching the consequences of her reckless decisions unfold. By evening, The county inspectors had begun directing controlled drainage, assessing the damage, and preparing formal reports for legal and insurance purposes. The creek, though partially restored, was a reminder that nature and law cannot be ignored. Standing on my porch, looking at the slowly draining water and the HOA homes partially submerged, I realized the lesson had been clear. Arrogance and entitlement can be undone in an instant. Karen thought she could control the land, the residents, and even nature itself, but the reality was undeniable. The HOA had learned a painful truth. Their actions had consequences. Their oversight, arrogance, and greed had allowed nature, law, and persistence to deliver justice. And as the sun set, I knew one thing for certain. No amount of concrete, fines, or bylaws could erase the damage or the lesson Karen had earned the hard way. Nature had won. The HOA had lost.